for national development. However, on reflection, I amended the topic by striking out the political components to retain just the economic. I did this for the following reasons. Discussing economic and political formula for Nigeria in one paper is not something that a one-day colloquium in Sokoto is enough to espouse. Secondly, I have grown weary of theorizing on issues that pose a second-level problematic, given the fact that many suggested panaceas may require constitutional amendments. Thirdly, there is enough in recent confabs and commissions that have identified and provided solutions to Nigeria's political woes. All we need is to distill them and find a will to apply them. And finally, I think that many Nigerians who struggle with the daily issues of where the next meal will be coming from and how to live a life that is worth living are not concerned about the political system you use in guaranteeing them sustenance. Just get the job done by any means necessary. This therefore means that, borrowing the words of the famous American political analyst James Caville, is the economy stupid? In 1985, some of us from the East will know the famous high-life musician Bright Chimezie. He released his hit track titled Life of Yesterday. In that hit single, Bright bemoans the fate of the 10 kobo denomination. He wondered why 10 kobo, which used to be enough to take to markets and still had enough left to quote booze, was no longer enough to support life. Well, this is a live telecast, I understand. If Mr. Bright Chimezie is watching this telecast, I want to break your heart today by telling you that 10 kobo, while it remains a legal tender in Nigeria, there are about 200 million Nigerians that have not seen that coin in over 30 years, let alone be available to purchase anything. In fact, 2 generations of Nigerians will not even understand what the hell he's talking about. The economy is such a bad shape that we have been described as the poverty capital of the world. The implication is that any leader or policymaker worth their onions must know that yesterday's prescription for today's sickness is now obsolete, and only a radical incision can cure this malignancy. Development for late development states like Nigeria can simply not follow the path of the received wisdom of liberal economic orthodoxy. I therefore argue in this paper that Nigeria and other third world countries desirous of rapid economic development for their citizens must be ready to denounce and purge themselves of the Bretton Woods institution's panacea for economic turmoil. What then is development? We will need to conceptualize development to move forward. Development is a multi-dimensional process involving the reorganization and reorientation of the entire economic superstructure and social systems. It transcends beyond the improvement in income and output to the radical transformation in institutional, social, and administrative structures. Although development is commonly seen in a national context, its holistic realization may necessitate fundamental modifications of the international economic and social system. Development is therefore a many-sided process. At the level of the individual, it also connotes increased skill and capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. This is just to quote Walter Rodney. Although the orthodox view of the development assumes that growth in income will translate automatically to improvements in the welfare of the citizens of any given country, due to the experience of many less developed countries in the 1950s and 1960s, which revealed the simultaneous existence of rapid growth on the one hand and the general deterioration in the condition of human life. Attempts have therefore been made to humanize the concept of development. In the thinking of CS, for instance, evaluation of development levels must be concerned with what has been happening to poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Besides, Development is a continuous process of generating and more efficiently allocating resources for achieving greater socially satisfying ends. Development is anchored on 4 theoretical perspectives. I will not go into the details of these theoretical perspectives, but they are the linear stage of growth model, theories and patterns of structural change, international development revolution, dependence revolution, and the neoclassical free market counter-revolution. The first, the linear stage of growth model, was propounded by American economic historian W. Rostow. The identified stages of development are the traditional society, preconditions for takeoff into self-sustaining growth, the takeoff, and then the drive to maturity and the age of high mass consumption. We will leave it at that. The structural change model emphasizes the process by which underdeveloped countries transform their economics from reliance on traditional subsistence agriculture to a more modern, more urbanized, and more industrially diverse manufacturing and service economy. We will also leave that at that. While the international dependence revolution model relies on the belief that developing countries are beset by institutional, political, and economic rigidities, both domestic and international, and are caught in a dependent and dominant relationship with rich countries. And of course, the fourth, the neoclassical free market counter-revolution, is exactly what it is: a call for markets to be the total determinant of development and economic growth. So, let us now come home and look at the development planning trajectory in Nigeria. Between 1960 and 1990, there have been different kinds of development planning. Before independence in 1960, the economy was characterized by the dominance of exports and commercial activities, as there was no viable industrial sector. However, there is a disagreement in literature that the first attempt at development planning in Nigeria started in 1946 with a 10-year plan of development and welfare. The plan, which was expected to run to 1956, came to an abrupt end in 1951 due to the constitutional changes that introduced federalism. Thus, the plan ran concomitantly with other plans for each of the then 4 regions of the federation, namely the West, the North, and the Southern Cameroons. The hidden objective of the plan was to meet the perceived needs of the colonial government and not necessarily a conscious effort to influence the overall performance of the Nigerian economy. Like I said, there have been other development plans between them. But I will jump, for the purpose of time, and go straight to one that most of us here, if not all, will remember: the Structural Adjustment Program of 1986 to 1988. The Structural Adjustment Program was introduced on 26 September 1986 with the following objectives: to restructure and diversify the productive base of the economy in order to reduce dependence on the oil sector and on imports, to achieve fiscal and balance of payments viability over the period in view, to lay the basis for a sustainable non-inflationary growth, and to reduce the dominance of unproductive investments in the public sector by improving public sector efficiency and enhancing the growth potential of the private sector. Professor Sifowiski affirmed that SAP rested on a number of pillars, namely deregulation of the value of the naira, which was considered to be overvalued then, deregulation of interest rates, which at SAP's inception was below 10%, removal of subsidies on government-provided goods and services. A corollary of the last pillar is the policy of privatization and commercialization, which was considered necessary on the dual account that government was already overbloated and unwieldy, and that by extension, its public enterprises and agencies were wasteful and inefficient. As a matter of fact, the strong push by the Bretton Woods institutions for Nigeria to implement SAP was to galvanize the country to pursue its loan repayment obligations. The emphasis on expenditure reduction was to ensure that there was adequate fund for debt servicing and repayment. The economic reform program under SAP appeared to have intensified speculative and trading activities rather than increasing production. The proliferation of merchant banks, finance houses, deregulation of interest rates, privatization of the economy, and the new industrial policy did not bring in the needed foreign direct investment. The private sector did not live up to expectations, despite the fact that the government then was favorable. The share of manufacturing in GDP was still low, while capacity utilization was a little above 30%. Industry had to devise strategies to cope with the various aspects of the new regime, as well as a slump in effective demand. There was deliberate shift to local raw material sourcing by industry as one of the ways to cope with some of the challenges of this era. The increase in the cost of imports and pressure by government resulted in the rise of local raw material sourcing by industry from 38% in 1985 to 50% in 1988. Regarding privatization and commercialization, the public utilities had taken them to mean increased prices without corresponding efficiency and productivity. The unjustifiable price hikes, sometimes in the range of 500 to 2,000%, compounded problems for the industrial sector and the provision of social services. The increased prices paid by consumers further reduced the latter's already declining real wages. The reform program has sought to encourage export promotion, but traditional exports could not bring in the much needed foreign exchange. The persistent depreciation of the naira vis-a-vis other major currencies created further distortions in the economy. The instability in the exchange rate created uncertainty and fueled inflation. The external balance remained in disarray despite the devaluation of the domestic currency, while external debts mounted. The mismanagement of the foreign exchange market resulted in huge profits for the financial sector. This was due to the wide differential between the official rate and the parallel market rate. Consequently, there was a boom in the financial sector, although not in the other sectors of the economy. By the end of the 1980s, it was readily apparent that SAP had failed. The country's industrial capacity utilization, which was at 73.6% in 1981, declined consistently during the period, such that by 1988 it was 31%. Growth in manufacturing, which was 14.6% in 1981, dropped to 3.2% in 1989. This poor performance occurred despite various stabilization policies of the 80s. The period witnessed the escalation of poverty, with the incidence rising from 28.1% in 1980 to 43.6% in 1985. After a slight decline to 42.7% in 1992, it climbed rapidly to 65.6% of the population in 1996, according to UNDP and World Bank figures. The worst scenario of brain drain, that is the Japa syndrome, started then, occurred during the period with deleterious effects on university education and on the health sector. The problem of unemployment, deepened until today, remains on top of the social disruptions and security threats facing the country. Interest rates deregulation under SAP remains one of the most anti-development policies of the time. It pushed the lending rate into double-digit level, where it has remained till date. And this has stalled industrial expansion and a meaningful development in the real sector. And guess who the main proponents of SAP regime were? Your guess is as good as mine, the Bretton Woods institutions. After SAP, Nigeria resorted to the use of the period, the rolling plans and, vision, vision 2010 and whatever, period. So they resorted to the use of ad hoc short-term instruments for economic management, leading to the description of that period by no other person than Sanusi Dagash as the Rolling Stones that gathered no moss. He added that in a bid to have a long-term national vision on which development should be anchored, a bold attempt was made to articulate a national vision program called the Vision 2010. We know how that happened and what happened. It also failed. Take us to 1999 to 2007. President Olusegun Obasanjo came with his need strategy document. One of the anchors of the need strategy document was that It is developed by the people and for the people. The need was touted as homegrown, and that it is the alternative to the poverty reduction strategy paper that was endorsed by the World Bank to be prepared by heavily indebted poor countries. It was designed for poverty reduction, wealth creation, employment generation, infrastructural regeneration, and reorientation. The NIS framework was built on 4 key pillars, such as redefining the role of government in the economy, creating an enabling environment for private sector growth, improving social services delivery, and creating a new value system. In the implementation of needs, emphasis was placed on macroeconomic management. Fiscal and monetary policy measures were carefully managed to enhance macroeconomic stability, which is critical for growth and economic development. A major component of the fiscal reform was the decision to smoothen the expenditure pattern and thus the pattern of gross domestic product growth by adopting an oil-based fiscal rule in which government expenditure was based on a prudent oil price benchmark. Despite rising oil prices, government revenue projection was based on conservative oil prices of then, in 2004, $25 per barrel. In 2005, $30 per barrel. In 2006, $35 per barrel. And in 2007, $40 per barrel. The adoption of the oil price-based oil price. Government fiscal balance moved from the previous 3.5% of GDP deficits to a consolidated fiscal surplus of about 10% of GDP in 2004 and 11% GDP in 2005. Naturally, the external reserves increased from over 4 billion prior to May 1999 to 42 billion by the end of December 2006 and 43.5 billion as at May 4, 2007. The high reserves level came very handy in Nigeria's exit of the Paris Club and London Club debts. The government paid $12.2 billion and $1.4 billion to exit the Paris Club and London Club debts. The money was taken from the excess crude proceeds account, a part of the reserves. Need was supposed to cost about $4.5 billion through 2007. And government was supposed to, as it was implementing needs, also eliminate waste and selling assets and reforming the tax laws. The underlying planning framework was grossly inadequate for needs. No resource envelope was articulated to permit an assessment of the capability of the nation to finance this initiative. And yes, even though President Olusegun Obasanjo wants us to believe that the needs document was a document that was produced by Nigerians and for Nigerians, you could smell the Bretton Woods institutions all over the documents. So that brings us. Why then, we've talked about the various development plans and the strategies. Why then do they fail? In my opinion, they fail because, one, there's a lack of clear vision. This has been identified as the foundational basis for the disjointed mission of development planning in Nigeria. And secondly, the absolute alignment to Western pattern and notion of development. Any development plan and initiative that does not encourage the disengagement of the Nigerian economy from the exploitative structural links to Western capitalist economy may not succeed. And why is this so? Well, let us evaluate development episodes in Nigeria. Policies are products of planning. The fundamental need for planning is to achieve the set of macroeconomic objectives, which includes rapid economic growth and development, price stability, maintaining favorable external balance, reduced unemployment, and so on. The connotation of the above is that planning is tailored towards driving a set of macroeconomic variables to desirable dispositions and positions. The essence of any development program is often to reduce poverty among the people, so that people would enjoy good living conditions. Development is the answer to poverty. A poverty-stricken society can never be said to be developed. Thus, poverty means underdevelopment, while development means the absence of or near absence of poverty. If poverty can thus be equated with underdevelopment and development be equated with the absence of poverty, it can therefore be inferred that cutting across the globe, there are two major economic worlds: the developed worlds of Europe and America, and the underdeveloped worlds of the third world countries. Until recently, underdeveloped societies were mainly referred to as third world countries and less developed countries. These third world countries or less developed countries are usually associated to countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Their major characteristics being a low-level economy, low-level political development, the tendency to keep to themselves free from the influence of the capitalist world, mutual colonial experience which left them independent, beginning especially from the 1945 after the outbreak of the Second World War, when the clamor for self-rule became intensified amongst these countries. By 1945, after World War II, and when many of the colonized societies began to have their independence, a lot of scholarly interests concerning development arose. And so you had different kinds of classifications for these so-called, usually termed third world countries. So it has been referred to as underdeveloped. Where you have the underdeveloped, then you have the developed world. Then where you have the so-called metropole, then you have the satellites. Where you have the center, then you have the periphery. All these are attempts at classifying societies according to their level of economic development. So while the developed metropole center connotes the developed economies, underdeveloped satellites and periphery implies underdeveloped economies. However, at the end of the Cold War, these terms started becoming obsolete. And so the concepts of the global north and the global south arose. While the global north implies the developed countries, the global south implies the underdeveloped economies. Four broad indicators distinguish global north economies from global south economies: technological inventiveness, wealthy and aging population, since most of these societies are tending towards zero population growth, while also most of them are democratic. For the global south, the economies possess the opposite of what I have just listed. So the global north is made up of countries like the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Japan, France, Spain, Belgium, Israel, a country of South Africa, Norway, Italy, and Sweden, except a few exceptions, but these are the countries of the global north. While the global south, on the other hand, comprises the rest of Africa, India, Mexico, China, Indonesia. Why have I taken time to explain this? Because we want to go into a little bit of comparative analysis. And my comparative analysis is to look at the performance trends of selected countries. Stick with me, we are going somewhere. The states I've taken for comparative analysis with Nigeria are India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the United States of America. And I want to start this analysis with the average growth rate of GDP. The Nigerian economy has been in a state of comatose since the 1960s. It has been established. After averaging 2.9% in the 1960s, GDP growth increased to 7% in the 1970s, fueled by increased crude oil production. This high growth era was followed by a period of economic crisis that led to a negative growth of -1.4% in the 1980s on the back of declining global crude oil prices. The Nigerian economy recorded average GDP growth of 2.6% in the 1990s, rising to 7.9% in the next decade due to rising crude oil prices and the liberalization of the telecom sector, which attracted investments into the sector. This period reflected improved economic policy of the NEES era. The major drivers remained agriculture, wholesale and retail trade and services sector. From 2011 to 2020, GDP growth averaged 2.6%, with a negative growth rate of -1.6% recorded in 2016. Indeed, the last decade has been a period of rebirth, as affirmed by almost all macroeconomic indicators, but the growth rate has not been high enough to push down the poverty profile. So, the economic growth is slower than the poverty rate. A review of the statistics from comparable countries, for example, like Malaysia, Indonesia, and India, can be used to bear a remarkable resemblance to Nigeria today. In terms of the structure of the economy and economic policies, Malaysia in the 1960s, Indonesia and India in the 1980s were similar to Nigeria today. Based on GDP per capita, all three countries trailed behind Nigeria before the 1980s, but overtook it one after the other after reforms delivered a more diversified economy. Much like Nigeria today, Malaysia in the 1960s and Indonesia in the 1980s heavily depended on natural resources, which were the primary source of their government revenues and foreign exchange earnings. Malaysia's natural resources were in the form of agricultural commodities, with rubber and tea being most important. Indonesia in the 1980s produced about 1.5 million barrels of crude oil per day, and this oil sector accounted for about 10% of GDP. Both oil production level and its contribution to GDP were almost the same as in Nigeria today. Oil revenue accounted for about 70% of government revenue in the early 1980s, also on par with Nigeria's current oil revenue to total oil revenue ratio in the early 2010. Indonesia enjoyed remarkable economic growth between 1960 and 1989 as GDP growth increased from an average of 3.5% in the 1960s to 7.2% in the 1970s, before dropping to 5.9% in the 1980s. In nominal terms, the economy expanded from $64 billion in 1961 to $289 billion in 1989, meaning that Indonesia became the fourth largest economy in East Asia, just behind China, Japan, and South Korea. Nominal GDP had risen to $932 billion in 2016, making Indonesia the 16th largest economy in the world, according to the IMF in 2017, with a contribution of 1.5% to global GDP. Indonesia's economic progress can be traced to its government's efforts since the mid-1980s to pursue widespread industrialization supported by import substitution and export-oriented policies. As noted by Vlasbom, quote, in Indonesia, the expanding role of the oil industry was accompanied by a rise in the production of industrial goods. In the 1990s, the latter accounted for more than half of the added value of the secondary sector. Unquote. During the import substitution period, Malaysia, Indonesia, and India all featured assertive state intervention. I take that again. All these countries featured assertive state intervention in the form of trade and industrial policies. The Pioneer Industries Ordinance of Malaysia in 1958 provided incentives and tariff projection for manufacturing. Indonesia's industrial policies in the early 1980s were pursued through restrictive and discretionary investment procedures. Sectors were rarely chosen based on economic feasibility, but on those deemed to be strategic importance, such as petrochemicals and auto parts. India's industrial licensing before the 1990s set quantitative constraints on industries. The government could dictate the location and scale of the plants. In the 1970s, promotion of foreign direct investment in manufacturing through free trade zones, tax incentives, and education of its workforce, as well as emphasis on technological upgrading, were most important factors in Malaysia's diversification of the economy. The decisive reforms introduced in Indonesia in the 1990s included customs reforms that significantly reduced clearing time and import costs, import liberalization, and trade deregulation that dismantled quantitative restrictions and reduced non-tariff barriers for importers substantially. Such reforms laid the foundation for Indonesian exporters to gain competitive inputs from international markets. Indonesia has become an export-oriented and internationally competitive economy since then. India's new industrial policy and the export-import policy in the early 1990s eliminated industrial licensing, relaxed foreign investment rules, and introduced sweeping trade liberalizations. While liberalization in the manufacturing sector was limited, the liberalization in the service sector alone led to the dawning of a period of rapid diversification and improvement in living standards. If you take, we've just done the GDP, if you take inflation, the same results. If you take inequality, the same results. I will just jump to the GDP per capita of these comparative states. The average real GDP per capita was about, in Nigeria, 1,222 between 1950, that is dollars, between 1950 and 1959. Since the independence of Nigeria in 1960, the average growth rate of its per capita GDP has been 1.7% per year. The GDP per capita reached a peak of about US dollars 1,804 on average between 1976 and 1979 during the military period of Chief Olusegun Obasanjo. After the Obasanjo's military regime, the declining trend of average real GDP per capita was observed. Prior to the adoption of the 1986 Structural Adjustment Program in the country, the average per capita was almost $1,544 between 1960 and 1985. However, a decline in the real GDP per capita was experienced after the SAP era. The real GDP per capita on average stood at 1,446 when the country was under the military regime. The least growth rate in the country was attributed to the period before the democratic system of government. In the same vein, the rate of GDP per capita growth in the post-SAP era was higher compared to the pre-SAP era. So compared with other African and Asian countries, especially Indonesia, which is comparable to Nigeria in most respects, economic development in Nigeria has been, at best, disappointing. With GDP of about 45 billion in 2001 and per capita income of about $300 a year, Nigeria has become one of the poorest countries in the world. As of 2000, it had earned about $300 billion from oil exports since the mid-1970s, but its per capita income was 20% lower than in 1975. Meanwhile, the country has become so heavily indebted, external and domestic debt amount to about 70% of GDP, that it has become difficult servicing this debt. Regional and sectoral unevenness in growth performance is high. From the foregoing, it is simply clear that to raise 200 million Nigerians out of poverty, as this current administration has resolved to do within the next decade, it will take more than just making it a campaign mantra, but a radical departure from economic orthodoxy of the global north, evinced in the Washington Consensus model. Since that is the case, what then is the role of the state in economic development? There is currently great pressure on developing countries from the developed world, and the International Development Policy establishment that it controls to adopt a set of good policies, quote unquote, and good institutions to foster their economic development. According to this Washington Consensus agenda, good policies, quotes unquote, are broadly classified as those prescribed by the Washington Consensus model, the Bretton Woods, the IMF, and the World Bank. They include the following: restrictive macroeconomic policy, liberalization of international trade and investment, privatization and deregulation. The good institutions are essentially those that are to be found in developed countries, especially the Anglo-American ones. The key institutions include democracy, good bureaucracy, an independent judiciary, strongly protected private property rights, including intellectual property rights, and transparent and market-oriented corporate governance and financial institutions, including a politically independent central bank. However, therein lies the hypocrisy of the West. History has shown that most developed countries did not achieve their current level of development through the policies and the institutions that they recommend to developing countries today. Most of them actively use the policies they term bad, trade and industrial policies, such as infant industry protection and export subsidies. Practices that these days are frowned upon, if not actively banned by the World Trade Organization. Until they were quite developed, that is until about the late 19th century to the early 20th century, they had very few of these institutions deemed essential by developed countries today, including such basic institutions as central banks and limited liability companies. For more on how these states develop their economies, please consult Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. The 19th century German economist Friedrich List who is commonly referred to as the father of the infant industry argument, is of the view that in the presence of more developed countries, backward countries like Nigeria cannot develop new industries without state intervention, especially tariff protection. For this, you can read his masterpiece, The National System of Political Economy, which was published in 1841. Both economists and policymakers have accepted that the orthodox neoclassical model has limitations, acknowledging that liberalized markets are not always efficient and market failures can be significant. They have recognized the need for greater government intervention in fields such as labor market and regional policy, and in monetary and financial policy. In many of these fields and others, especially the OECD countries, they have been in the forefront of this new analytical and policy development and new thinking. These shifts have become important, but in the face of the challenges and problems our economies now face, we do not believe that these are enough or they go far enough. Over a period of about 30 years, up to the financial crisis of the 2008, the dominant model of economic growth in the developed countries rested to a considerable extent on a very particular form of neoclassical economic theory. This made relatively simple assumptions about how economic actors behave and the implications of these for the functioning of the economy as a whole. In turn, this led to a variety of orthodox prescriptions for economic policy, which were by no means universal, were widely adopted in both developed and developing countries. At the heart of this theory was an assumption of rational economic behavior. Individuals maximize their utility based on preferences formed outside of the economic processes. Businesses sought to maximize their profits. At the level of the whole economy, most macroeconomic models before 2008 were constructed using the tools of neoclassical economics. Such models typically assume that households and businesses behave in a homogeneous way, so could be modeled as representative agents. Though individual markets might involve frictions of various kinds, the long-run tendency of the economy was towards an equilibrium state, generally assumed to be at full employment. Shocks were regarded as exogenous, coming from outside the system rather than from within it. With the advent of new data sources, economics has become much more empirical. Macroeconomics models, meanwhile, have been modified to include different kinds of financial institutions and rigidities and shocks of various kinds. In critical fields, from the financial crisis to the growth and impact of inequality, from the rise of environmental degradation to the slowdown in productivity growth, economists have come to acknowledge that orthodox approaches had done a poor job of anticipating or explaining key developments. In turn, many economic policy institutions have acknowledged the limitations and failures of the more simplistic free market prescriptions of the pre-crisis era. It has been generally accepted, for example, that financial regulation needs to go beyond individual firms to the systemic risks, which the financial sector as a whole can generate. What then for Nigeria and other developing countries? As I conclude this lecture, I state the following. In espousing a growth trajectory for Nigeria and calling for a rejection of the World Bank IMF-backed strategy for development, this paper leans heavily on the role of the development state and anchors this bias based on Ha-Joon Chang's critique of the prevailing economic development strategies by providing a historical analysis of the how, where current development countries achieved their economic status. If you have not taken anything from this lecture, here are some key points that you should take home and that you should elaborate on regarding the position and the development strategies that third world countries, especially Nigerians, must adopt. First, third world countries will have a historical context of development. This context shows that many of today's developed countries, such as the United Kingdom, the United States, achieve growth through strategies like tariffs, subsidies, regulations to protect their nascent industries. This historical perspective contrasts sharply with the free market liberalization policies they now promote for developed countries. The neoliberal policies advocated by institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, such as rapid liberalization of trade and investment, privatization and deregulation, are not consistent with the historical experiences of successful development. In fact, these policies might even hinder the growth of developing nations by exposing them prematurely to global competition. This paper describes as total rubbish the Washington Consensus model that says the state has no business in business. In fact, business is the business of the state. The money that you use in business, who created it in the first instance? The state. The minimalist role of the state in business, as proposed by neoliberalism, must be challenged. The state must play a significant role in guiding economic development, similar to the way it was utilized by now developed countries during their own developmental stages. This includes the use of tariffs, subsidies, and other forms of government intervention to support budding industries. Shall we forget hastily how former President Donald Trump used tariffs to effectively protect the American economy from the onslaught of the Chinese trade practices? Developed countries should have the autonomy to choose policies that best suit their unique economic conditions and developmental stages. This contrasts with the one-size-fits-all approach often prescribed by international economic organizations. Developing countries are encouraged to learn from the historical experiences of the developed nations, understanding that the path to economic development is not linear and varies significantly based on a country's specific context. Developing countries must challenge the current intellectual property rights regime protected by the WTO and enforced as part of the globalization. Not doing this may stifle innovation and development in the global south. By providing this historical and critical analysis, I dare Nigerian leaders and economic policymakers to not be afraid to challenge conventional economic wisdom and call for a more nuanced and historically informed approach to economic development policy, especially for developing countries. There is now an urgent need for policy diversity and experimentation, making it incumbent on policymakers to acknowledge that strategies successful in one country may not be universally applicable. In essence, this paper is a call for more equitable global economic system that recognizes the varied paths to development and respects the sovereignty of nations in charting their economic courses. My critique of the one-size-fits-all approach to economic policy is a reminder that development is a complex, multifaceted process that cannot be reduced to simple formulas or models. I end this paper by reminding leaders of the third world, especially Nigeria, that in the words of Frantz Fanon, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill or betray it. The lives of billions of Nigerians are at stake. You cannot afford to betray this mission of economic emancipation. Thank you for listening.
Wow, that was quite brilliant. There are so many takeaways. And as earlier on predicted by the chairman, Dr. Chima Amadi has eloquently and indisputably proved that he understood the topic very well. Certainly, he has done justice to it. The chairman is going to say more about this, but for me, the major takeaways are two. One, the formula that Nigeria needs for development, according to the paper and as practiced by the Asian Tigers and India, is assertive state control. And I think that is quite poignant. The second major takeaway is that we don't need the Washington Consensus economic prescription. Mr. Chairman, I'll hand over to you for a brief dissection of the paper.
distinguished guests, invited, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree with me the prescription I made earlier of trying to explain or to let you know the stock made of my brother Dr. Ahmadi is absolutely clear to everyone now. I think the least we could do, given the rich content that Dr. Ahmadi presented here, which had actually go beyond the scope of even this colloquium, our focus is basically a Nigerian perspective. And you took the world view and X-ray global development mechanism over the past 3, 4, 5 decades, and then narrowed down to what lessons Nigeria should do. Without much ado, please, ladies and gentlemen, invited guests, let us please give another resounding applause to the church. Now, because of two compelling realities, one, the fact that the Chuma had to leave us, they have other very, very compelling engagements in a way, and the fact that time of Zuru prayer is approaching, so I would like to seek indulgence of our ambassador guests also who will delay our remarks first. I just want to give a very, very brief 1 to 2 minute summary of his submission. Because classically, what he submitted is the reason why we are where we are. The lack of cognizance to the value history presents on our value proposition. And that is why he commenced the paper by trying to let us understand what is the theoretical framework that underpins the concept of development, and what are the commonly known four methodologies that development can be used to be attained, and how that has been attained over time, and then X-ray down to our local system. The pre-colonial era, the colonial era, what are the development approaches that Nigeria has adopted, and then narrow down on SR, the structural adjustment program, which was the most impactful economic policy in terms of development reality that Nigeria have had, that we're still struggling to get out of to today. Now, went further to also look at what are some of the comparative realities. If you look at everything, demographics, geography, and everything between Nigeria, Indonesia, Malaysia, and India, there are quite a lot of similarities that make statistical sense for one to make comparison. And then he x-rayed the journey of all these countries, vis-a-vis our reality too, and use their own development reality comparatively with the developed world, and propose what should be a Nigerian solution. Ladies and gentlemen, one key very big takeaway that the Chima Ahmadi mentioned is that for any nation to grow, and particularly Nigeria, our development solution must be homegrown. They must take into cognizance and into account our realities in terms of geography, in terms of resource outlay, in terms of culture. And as a matter of fact, he also espoused the main realities that today you have an enclave called the Asian Tigers. It's purely because they had to really look at what he tried to espouse here, historically, and disconnect themselves from every proposal or proposition of the Western world and say, no, we have to have a homegrown solution. And that's why today they are where they are today. Of course, another big takeaway that he mentioned is emphasizing the role of states. Can you just allow markets to be a sustainable driver of economic value proposition for society? Absolutely, the answer is no. Because markets in economic sense are designed to fail naturally. Because demand and supply fundamentals respond to too many externalities that are not in control of anybody. And that is why the role of government in making sure that economic stabilization hinges on sound, assertive policies like he mentioned. And assertiveness here is actually another concept of protectionism. How do you ensure that you protect and empower your own value systems? Whether you are coming from your own entrepreneurs, whether you are coming from your own businesses, whether you are talking in terms of resources. And I think these are very, very big takeaways that certainly, if we are to change the narrative of where we are going, definitely we have to basically take note of them. Another very important factor that he highlighted, and thank you very much, Dr. Amadi. Honestly, this particular one is the factor that receives the least attention in the development context of developing nations. The role of intellectual property in driving innovation, development, and progress. And I give a simple example of what the Shima is saying. A real terms. Today, a very big market that has sprung up in Nigeria, that has become an international brand, is called the Nollywood market, the creative industry today. As a matter of fact, everywhere you go in the world today, Davido, Burna Boy, Whiskey, and the rest of them are actually the most popular thing about Nigeria than Nigeria itself. Do you agree with me? What he is saying, okay, these are gentlemen and women that grew on their own intellectual and talented capacity that has become a global brand today. How does the Nigerian state ensure that this creativity is protected so that these gentlemen and women can actually have the desired value it ought to present on table? It's a market that employs millions of Nigerians today. And if you compose our GDP today in its component element within the service sector, certainly this market, this particular good will feature in it. We have universities that are churning out researches on a daily basis. Who does what with that research? There is the National Office of Technology, National Office of Technology Adaptation and Acquisition and Promotion. That is the entity saddled with the responsibility of licensing patents for Nigeria. How many patents have been licensed? So, ladies and gentlemen, please permit me to end my summary here. Obviously, there are a lot more points than what I have just mentioned. I just focus on the 4 key elements that he mentioned. I actually have jotted about 12 of them. Unfortunately, we are running with time is no longer our friend. And the 2 reasons I mentioned at the beginning of my speech are also confronting us very badly. So without too much ado, I'm going to end here, and certainly when we commence the panel session, I'm going to give a much more detailed insight into what he presented and the solution framework that he proposed to change the narrative of our dear country so that our teaming 200 million people can be better in terms of volume. Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, it is only honorable to reciprocate honor with another gesture. Of course, we are in no means going to measure the value that Dr. Amadi has presented to this gathering, but it is also our cultural prescription that we should show a small token of appreciation. And Dr. Amadi, I would like to call the convener of this colloquium, Engineer Zayan Tambari Yabo, to please present you with an appreciation plan.
Thank you very much. Please, may I invite also my father, Alhaji Tambari Waziri, to join in this unique and historical honor. Amadi has been part and parcel of our family. He's a well-known person in Sokoto. He has been here many, many times in the past, and this is homecoming for him. So we now invite the head of the Waziri's family in Yabo to present this token of appreciation to Dr. Chima Amadi for coming all the way from the United Kingdom. All of our invitation to come back home and support to present yourself. This is the thank you.
minutes.
Okay.
For 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please, I would like to, still in the interest of timing, I think it's only apt that we should also give honor to our distinguished guests. And at this juncture, I would like to invite Alhaji Sani Umar Jabi Sarkingagi, who is ably representing His Eminence the Sultan of Sokoto, for a goodwill remark, please.
The chairman of the occasion, our honorable guest speaker, Dr. Amadi, our convener, Engineer Zayanu Yabo, His Excellency the Governor of Sokoto State, who is heavily and adequately being represented by the Honorable Special Advisor to Governor on Security Matters.
Welcome back from the live telecast. We'll now continue with our regular programs. Stay tuned.
Every major news story is with many perspectives and layered with different levels of impact.
Hello. What time did this happen? We will be right there.
At TVC.
The well-being of the citizens of Sokoto and in Nigeria by extension. And then, having done that, I must also come back again to commend our guest speaker, who is far away from US, coming to Sokoto to deliver this very rich presentation. But I believe he even changed my thinking here. When I'm standing here before you, I'm just noticing so many issues. But I believe he made me change attention. That honestly, we need to change. From the leaders to the low class citizens, we need to change attitude. Like even last time when I was here also, I challenged people on behavior and attitudinal change toward patriotisms. One of the greatest problems in Nigeria is patriotisms. We need to be sincere. When we have person like Amadi, but sometimes you see regional consideration, tribalism, ethnicity. When we have Nigerians in our mind, so we achieve a lot. When we met in the US, if you see person, Igbo, Yoruba, when we meet together, they're very happy to see Nigerian. But when coming to Nigeria, you see very resourceful somebody like Amadi, but we say no. No, yes. So, however, but I want to challenge also you people to sometimes, you know, you need to integrate, you put a kind of Ngausa. Yes, the language of communication is a problem. If the people here 100% can understand all what he said, I believe we have done all. So one of the problems, if I, from his own presentation and also little what I have, you know, sometimes I'm speaking here now I'm speaking on behalf of the Sultan of Sokoto. But to some extent, I have also another divergent view, yes. You know, I am one of the 15-member Nigerian Population Advisory Groups in Nigeria. Nigerian problem, all he said, is an attribute of population, that we can't work. The population is a tool for development. But if we invest in population, to put base in population, and to harness the demographic dividends, then we can achieve greater. But in the event of Nigeria and other sub-Saharan Africa today, our population is a tool for destruction. You can see what is happening, banditry, Boko Haram issue. It's the effect of population on unproductive population. The population is a tool for development, like I mentioned. If you see China, India, they are high population people, but the development side is they are par better than Nigeria. So here, in the 1951, if I call you back, population of the globe, it is 2.something billion. Now I'm speaking to you, we are 8.something billion in 21st century. 21st century. That in 1951, Nigeria is about 60-something million. Today, we are 220 projected million population, largely dependent. So Nigeria, we cannot continue to depend on public sector to provide employment. Private sector, like he's doing, need to be invested more in private sector so that he mentioned so many things. In Sokoto, if I'm standing here before you to challenge you, Sokoto was recognized globally on the Sokoto Red God. Where is the Sokoto Red God today? Sokoto was also recognized globally on Sokoto Gudali. Globally. Where is that name today? It's no longer there. So we need to embark. And if you see the population is a tool, right from the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the little number of population, look at the production, how they separate even the religion globally. If you come to join the founder of the Caliphate of Sokoto, look at how they do. Look at the transformation they did in Sokoto and put in Sokoto different kind of business and skills. Thank you. So we need to see what we can do by Allah to see how we can change our behavior, change our attitude. If the Zayanu engineer, Zayanu can provide a lot of support for us, like I mentioned that time, giving engine, giving knitting machine, giving everything, it will end up diverting to market. So if you go to agriculture, most of us here, we have abundant farmland that we are not putting into use. We think agriculture is just no longer into. Agriculture is the mainstay of the country. It provides employment, the guarantee labor opportunity for the labor market to be well used. So thank you so much on this note. The time for Freya and others, I have to so much commend the Ahmadi, the keynote speaker, and our chairman of the occasion as well. All the ESCO that are putting together, helping the initiative of Sokoto, generating employment opportunity and the standard of living for Nigeria and Sokoto. I commend this effort on behalf of Sultan of Sokoto. I commend you, His Eminence Sultan of Sokoto. He has also asked me to extend his heartfelt appreciation to the founders of this initiative. He is with you, even though he's not here, he's with you 100%. Thank you so much.
If you can remain, sir, the convener will present the flag for you.
Okay.
The convener.
On behalf of the organizing committee, we wish to thank His Eminence Sultan of Sokoto and Haji Dr. Saad Abubakar III for all his fatherly support and role. He has been a strong pillar of support towards any of our activities. We always show concern. So please extend our heartfelt appreciation to His Eminence, and we will come to thank him for
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you
So much.
We will now call the representative of His Excellency, the Executive Governor, for few remarks. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, retired Colonel Ahmad A. Usman is the Special Advisor to the Executive Governor of Sokoto State on security matters. He's here standing in for His Excellency, the Executive Governor of Sokoto State, Dr. Ahmad Ali Sokoto FCME. You are most highly welcome.
Mr. Amadi, just like you are escaping, if not, next time we'll make sure that at least you spend a month. Because this your presentation at least needs like nothing less than a week. So that at least we'll now argue it. Not only take away, but at least. Okay, I am Colonel Ahmad Abdul Usman, retired special advisor on the security matters. Please permit me to stand on the existing protocol because no time to go through the protocol, please. I have representing His Excellency, Excellency Dr. Ahmad Aliyu, FCNA, the Executive Governor of Sokoto State, which was seriously engaged. At this point, on behalf of His Excellency, let me begin by commending in the effort of the organizers of this national colloquium, which is the fourth in the series since inception in 2017. For initiating this laudable program that is set to bring together experts from all over the country to discuss on the topical national issues. This year gathering with the theme Nigerian in search of an effective political or economic. You are interested on the economic formula for the national development. It's coming at the right time when Nigeria is facing various political and economic challenges of development. This deliberation by experts drawn from various sectors, we believe, will critically analyze the issues and provide valuable solutions to support our collective aspirations for growth and development in our states and the nation. We will welcome any suggestions and recommendations gathered towards our common development. Moreover, I personally just wanted to send a big shout out and good luck to all the amazing speakers, especially you. I know we are still going to have some. And participants at this colloquium, may your discussion be insightful, your connections be fruitful, and your knowledge be expanded. Enjoy even and make most out of this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, gentlemen, and God bless you.
Your Excellency, we have a token of appreciation quickly. We deeply appreciate the support, the solidarity, and the guidance of His Excellency, the Executive Governor, Ahmed Aliyu, for being supportive. We thank you, Honorable Advisor, for coming here also, and assure His Excellency of our continued support. And we will come personally to thank him for his efforts. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. So our guest speaker will be leading. We'll have a brief photograph also with our guest. Then we will continue, please. We'll have a brief 10-15
Welcome back from the live telecast. We'll now continue with our regular programs. Stay tuned.
Every major news story is with many perspectives and layered with different levels of impact.
Hello. What time did this happen? We will be right there.
At TVC News, we follow the big and major news, gathering the facts, witnessing the outcome.
I am here live at the aftermath of the approval of the new national minimum wage.
We are TV Station of the Year, not just for breaking news, but for being first, fair and accurate. TVC News, first with breaking news.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is TVC News at 1. We turn our attention to the Nigerian Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers as they introduce a health scheme for the petroleum tankers drivers branch of the association. Senior correspondent Sharon Ijasa interacted with some of the tank drivers who are excited about the plan that allows them walk into any healthcare facility